handovers. Hello, I am indeed Sarah Sharpe. I'm going to be chairing this particular panel today. So I'm really excited to be chairing this panel. I think this is such an important conference, and I was really sad that I didn't have something I could present. So it's lovely to be able to facilitate this particular session. As with all the panels that you've attended yesterday, each speaker is going to be speaking for 15 minutes today. Speakers, I'm going to give a verbal reminder at the 3-minute mark that we're coming to the end of your talk. If you could draw your comments to a close as quickly as possible at that point, that would be really helpful and would ensure that everybody else on your panel gets an opportunity to share their ideas. For those of you listening, if you could, while you're listening to these fabulous papers, have a wee think about the questions you'd like to ask. That would be really wonderful. It'd be great to get a range of different perspectives on the material we'll be talking about in this session. So with no further ado, I'm delighted to introduce University of Aberdeen's own Dr. Eloise Gray. Now, Eloise Gray is a teaching fellow at the University of Aberdeen and an early career historian of emotions, family and empire in the long 18th century. Her work examines how imperial and metropolitan Scotland, plantation economies of the Americas, and East India Company spaces intersect with the boundaries and constitution of familial and social groups. She gained her PhD in history from the University of Aberdeen in 2020 with a thesis titled Family, Emotions and Empire, the Ogilvie Forbes at Boydenley House, c. 1740 to 1840. Her research uses epistolary sources to examine the history of racialised and gendered bodies, in particular the Scottish middling source, through familial and colonial praxis. So welcome, Eloise.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm going to now share my content. Okay, so hopefully, can you see the big screen?
Absolutely.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much. I will kick off then. In 1825, Mary Ogilvie wrote from Aberdeen to her uncle Alexander Irvine, Laird of Drum Castle, quote, "We have got your friend Georgie's sister with us and have the comfort to find her one of the most engaging, sweet-tempered children we ever met with. Georgie, George Ogilvie, was Mary's nephew and Alexander Irvine's great-nephew. The language suggests an affection between the aging patriarch and the boy, who would have been 7. These children's father was working in the East India Company army. Mary talked about caring for the children as, quote, a very great charge, and worried about their father's health in India, quote, we have been for some time and still are under great anxiety about their dear father, who had a most dangerous attack of fever about this time last year, the effects of which he had by no means recovered. His wife and infant boy proposed remaining at Cannanore until after the monsoon," end quote. Mary's sister, Rebecca, had written to her uncle in a similar fashion a year earlier. These missives were ways in which emotional connections between family members were woven. These women spent their adult lives in Aberdeen, and the movement of their menfolk and their children to and from imperial spaces shaped their lives. Scottish sojourners were dependent on the family at home, and the need to nurture affectionate relationships was part of this labour. In the 1770s, their father, George Ogilvie, had owned plantations in South Carolina, enslaving Africans to produce indigo and rice. George lost most of his property in the American Revolution after he died, and after he died in 1802, the family sold their estate of Achilles near Fraserburgh. The fact that Mary and her 2 sisters did not marry suggests their financial status did not support a marriage. The family tree shows the intergenerational engagement with empire, starting with the Americas in the 1700s, when 4 Ogilvie brothers went to Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, and Eustatia, respectively. In the following generation, George Ogilvie joined his uncle Charles in South Carolina, and Charles's sons, one went to India and the other returned to South Carolina. In the 19th century, 4 out of 5 of the next generation of Ogilvie sons were stationed in India. George and Alexander Ogilvie were the first to take their wives out. Those that remained looked after their nephews and nieces and suffered from these absences. Whilst most concerns were related to the physical risks, Anxieties about moral degeneration due to tropical climates were common. Encounters and relationships with non-European women was part of this imaginary. This paper argues that a style of affection between family members was unique to the period 1760 to 1830. It was part of the way imperial families survived socially and economically. The emotional culture was what sustained the boundaries of family. However, the children of non-European partners were not easily included in this emotional community. In this way, I argue that familial emotional cultures contributed to the creation of embodied whiteness. The relationship between bloodline and affection has been the subject of debate amongst historians of the family for the last 50 years. Demographic, societal and economic changes, as well as empire, created an insecure world, and as a consequence, families needed to pool economic and patronage resources in order to survive. Emotional resources were part of this process. Katie Barclay has argued that marriage and family life in Scotland became focused on the conjugal unit in the 18th century. However, she and others have challenged the idealised and closed nature of the nuclear family for this period, showing that historically the concept of family was a much larger, looser, more flexible entity. Such discussions largely centred on the metropole, with the overseas perspective notably absent. Work by Emma Rothschild and Margot Finn has to some extent provided a correction, showing the intense horizontal connections used by Scottish families of empire. Sarah Pearsall in particular argues that the pressures of empire, the insecurity and distance, created a shift in affection between family members. Quote, families did not get happier in the 18th century, they just emphasised claims of domestic harmony more in order to serve various ends. Historical kinship studies by Leonor Davidoff, David Warren Sabian, Christopher Johnson and others has argued that in Europe in the decades around 1800, a new regime of siblinghood, a sibling archipelago, emerged, which featured an emotional culture of intense sentiment between siblings. They argue that 17th century kinship models shifted as the elite became more dependent on the efforts and alliances of siblings. These changes in kinship patterns are argued to be common to property-owning classes across Western Europe. In Scotland, a gradual diminution of patronage power by the monarch and elite took place as institutions of state and empire, such as the military, grew. These nominally political trends impacted on family dynamics. Effective relationships between siblings mirrored this dependency, and the tenor of the emotional bonds reflected this. This familial regime relied on affection to cement the bonds between siblings and, by extension, aunts, uncles and cousins. This is evident in the correspondence of the Ogilvies from the 1760s. After the death of his wife in 1769, Carolina merchant and planter Charles Ogilvie left his 3 sons in Buchan with his sister Rebecca Forbes Pitligo and his brother Alexander, the Laird of O'Hires. Rebecca's description of her feelings for her brother are indicative of the sentiment of the period. Quote, our desire to see him is as great and as ardent as the most tender, the most sympathising heart can imagine, yet it proceeds from the true genuine love which cannot enjoy anything out in concert with the beloved. It is notable that apart from the occasional visit to O'Hires, Charles spent his adult life in London and South Carolina. Epistolary sensibility bridged these distances, and his siblings at O'Hires continued to be his emotional refuge. In the following generation, such affection is evident too. In 1786, Margaret Urquhart wrote of her feelings for George Ogilvie, her brother. I have a brother who till I knew, still dearer ties might be said to absorb my heart. George was either in London or Carolina when Margaret was 6 until she was married. To forge such a bond with an absent brother from a young age, her family would have been critical enablers of the relationship. These examples show that correspondence was thus the tool that reproduced the practice of sibling affection. Aunts and uncles also played an important role in fostering relationships between family members. One way they did this was by being closely involved in courtship, often providing their own children as marriage partners. Marriage strategies were intended to provide security across families. Indeed, cousin marriage was common amongst gentry families in Aberdeenshire in this period. George Ogilvy married his first cousin, Rebecca Irvine, when he returned from Caroline in 1779. Their son, Alexander Ogilvy, married Janet Rebecca Ogilvy, daughter of his first cousin, John Alexander Ogilvy, in 1825. Affection between cousins was actively nurtured by adults, as they were sometimes brought up together. Margaret Ogilvy was brought up with her cousin, Margaret Irvine. Their aunt, Rebecca, wrote in 1774 that the friendship between them was important. Quote, "Cousin Meg and her are very fond of each other, and I hope their friendship shall increase." End quote. In Sabian and Johnson's words, such horizontal families were a vast human chain bound by affection. So that's a quote, "A vast human chain bound by affection and understanding that is fairly clearly distinguished from other elements of society by virtue of their biological relationships. These kinship structures, which hold sibling affection of primary importance, were exclusive to property-owning classes and were fundamental for the formation of the bourgeoisie. Families created large constellations, helped each other in business, and through patronage opened opportunities for family members." Whilst the term bourgeoisie betrays the French sources of Johnson's work, there are strong parallels with the Scottish gentry. Leonore Davidoff, in her studies of sibling work and in her earlier work with Catherine Hall, argues that horizontal relationships were fundamental for the creation of the English middle class. They formed the infrastructure around which business, religion, and educational norms were established. Looking to Scotland, the gentry were, like the Anglo-Irish, disproportionately involved in empire. Arguments that Scottish kinship networks played a critical role in the British Empire are not new. However, the European nature of historical kinship patterns suggests that this is not a uniquely Scottish feature, but it would have had a Scottish character. The economic challenges of the 18th century were pronounced for Scottish gentry, and affectionate bonds may have gone some way to mitigate these challenges. The Ogilvies and the means by which aunts and uncles and siblings dominate these letters shows that this human chain bound by affection was important. A distinctive imperial class of Scots was being produced by this affective community and has implications for the creation of a white imperial class. The exclusion of non-Europeans and non-gentry women from marriage, as I have written elsewhere, was an established practice for this class. Given the blood connection to Scottish men, should mixed heritage children, however, not be permitted entry into the archipelago? Daniel
Eloise, you're muted. You're still muted. I don't know what's happened. No. Yes, right.
Has it been for a while?
It's not been for very long. It's just been for a couple of minutes,
a
couple of seconds.
Clearly, just scrolling. Okay, I'll just. Right, the exclusion of non-European and non-gentry women from marriage, as I've written elsewhere, was an established practice for this class. Given the blood connection to Scottish men, should mixed heritage children, however, not be permitted entry into the archipelago? Daniel Livesey argues for mixed heritage children of enslaved women that by the early 19th century there was a growth in prejudice against non-white children in Britain. This, combined with more class homogeneity, meant that non-white children were excluded from the ways of producing affectionate bonds with family members. Their networks were increasingly closed to them. In 1824, Dr. Charles Ogilvy, the son who did not go to Empire, and his wife Jane, received mixed heritage 10-year-old Alexander Scott Forbes from Bombay. Alexander's sister, Kitty Scott Forbes, had arrived in Aberdeen 5 years before. Kitty's departure had been brokered by John Charles's brother in India, William Ogilvy, for his fellow Aberdonian friend, Theodore Forbes, the children's father. Theodore Forbes' sister, Jane, was, of course, Dr. John Charles Ogilvy's wife. That Theodore's sister had married the brother of his intimate friends in India reveals something of the familial networks in operation. The mother of the children, an Armenian Indian woman, Eliza Kewick, was not entitled to enter the archipelago. Her children were separated from her and sent to Scotland. The lines of affection were cut with what could only be called emotional violence. As Jennifer Morgan has argued in her recent book, Reckoning with Slavery, white Europeans were those afforded the rights to kinship. Speaking of plantation economies, she argues that, quote, kinship posed dangers for an economic system in which race demarcated human beings as property, end quote. Let us be clear, neither Eliza nor her two children with Theodore were enslaved. However, the children arriving at the door of Dr. John Charles Ogilvie had been separated from their mother, and thus that kinship relation was ruptured. The silence in the family correspondence on these children is notable compared to the warmth of language around little Georgie. Their uncertain legitimacy and the fact that their mother was non-European meant that affectionate kinship bonds were not guaranteed. Kitty and Alexander had access to some capital and some genetic proximity, but this was precarious. Kitty did marry well, but this could have been exceptional, but her brother was more of a problem, and little affection was shown in correspondence between his uncles. Katie Barclay has argued that illegitimate Scottish children were cared for, but not so much cared about. Mixed heritage children, where the father had the means, were sometimes educated and socialised, but separated from their mothers. Thus, the archipelago on which these imperial families relied and invested in emotional energy was a way of excluding non-white people. Sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva writes of the ways in which racialized emotions have evolved due to the divergent histories. Such racialized emotions are ways in which power and difference becomes naturalized and exclusionary practices continue. The emotions, such as family affection, are thus both embodied histories and familial investments. It can be argued then that the embodiment of imperial and social history in the emotional culture played a role in creating a class of white Scottish men, women and children, and this gave them a material advantage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eloise. That was fantastic. I will now give you a second to pull that down and introduce our second speaker. So following on for that wonderful paper, we're going to be hearing from Sian Loftus. And Sian is an independent heritage consultant who's worked on Aberdeenshire's connections to the slave trade. She managed the project that produced the graphic novel, It Was Aberdeen, that details the life and colonial legacies of the Ramsay family of bursars. So Sian, I will hand over to you now.
Thank you. I'll just try and get the content set up. Do you have the opening slide there?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, thank you. I think I can only follow Eloise's paper, which is wonderful, with a caveat that this isn't an academic paper, but an insight into a community research project that was undertaken in one small parish in one small county of the northeast. I'll be splitting the talk into two parts. Firstly, a brief introduction to the project, and then into the main body of the presentation with an overview of some of the research findings. Bursars is a civil parish in the rural Aberdeenshire. It's about 30 miles inland from Aberdeen. The parish has a population of about 750 people in around 300 households, and it's spread over an area of 125 square kilometres. There is one small village, Fingen, with a few dozen houses, and then a number of smaller hamlets or clusters of houses spread around the parish. A century ago, there were 5 schools in the parish. There's now 1 school and a nursery, which caters for 33 primary children and 12 nursery pupils. The majority of land in the parish is owned by 3 estates, that's 3 families, one of whom is absentee. But representing the community in land management and ownership is a community development trust, Burst Community Trust. For those not familiar with the Scottish community buyout model, the trust has acquired, with government grant support, 2 commercial forests in the parish from the Forestry Commission. Legislation empowers communities to register interest in acquiring such assets and to apply for grant to acquire. Island community initiatives are perhaps the best known examples of successful buyouts in Scotland. The 2 commercial forests acquired by the Trust provide valuable income to manage a number of cultural and natural heritage assets that the Trust also owns and manages on behalf of the community, and to deliver wider benefit to the community. As an aside, and I think picking up on the herring and saltfish comments yesterday, on the right here is a water-powered turning mill, which once was a major producer of herring barrel bungs, the stoppers that go into the barrels. One of the built heritage assets in community ownership is the old school site, which is adjacent to the current primary school building. It was Burst Community Trust that developed and delivered the 2019 project looking into links between our community and chattel slavery. It was this community-led approach that steered the direction of the project. It focused not on the handful of landowning families that dominate the parish and their links with slavery, which might have been an easier research topic, but on wider community links, on the breadth of the impact of slavery divide money on our community over the centuries, and on the importance of understanding and acknowledging the slavery links with assets and community ownership, and using this new knowledge to guide us in stewardship of these places and objects. We went into the project knowing a few facts about our community's links with slavery. We knew that the old school, photographed here, was established in the 1730s with funds from the sale of enslaved people in Barbados. We knew that the same legacy had made a significant contribution to our parish poor fund, and that fund was only wound up in 1962. And we knew that the University of Aberdeen, then Marshall College, was another major beneficiary from this legacy, which was made by a former resident of the parish who had gone to Barbados in the late 1600s. These facts alone led us to an understanding that if our very small community was that deeply involved, then it was hard for any community in Scotland to argue that it was near us. The name of the project, it was Aberdeen, is the local Doric dialect for it was everyone. With funding from the Lottery Fund and Aberdeenshire Council, the community embarked on the project at the start of 2019. Central to the project was the idea that the research would be undertaken by community volunteer researchers, that they would steer the research and present their findings within the wider community and further afield. If, as a community, we were going to come to a new understanding about our community's links with chattel slavery, then it felt important to put the community at the heart of the research. We had a very dedicated core of researchers, from retired professionals to farmers and PhD candidates. Much of the research was able to be done online and in archives in Aberdeen and Edinburgh. Research findings informed a year-long programme of activities with the pupils of the primary school, with age-appropriate resources developed for every year group from 5 up. The secondary school, which is out with the parish, field trips, workshops, public displays, open days and talks. We were supported in all that we did by many people, including Sir Jeff Palmer, Alex Renton, who took time out of his own research in Jamaica to dig out some records for us, Jackie Kay, Scotch Mackerel, or our Poet Laureate, who unveiled a plaque at the school, and Matthew Lee, who's here today, a PhD candidate, who acted out as our academic advisor. It was important from the outset that we took advice from many people working in the field and that we understood where our research and our community's story fitted into the wider academic research. Important too that we didn't contribute to further trauma through our research and outputs, and for that we needed and sought support and guidance. That isn't to say we've got everything right, but we continue to learn. Outputs included interpretational panels along the community path which lead to the school, a graphic novel as a national resource for primary pupils, and a commemorative plaque at the school. Each tile of that plaque is made by someone in our community or involved in the project, in response to the project. And one of the most important aspects of the project for the children at the school is a partnership with a school in Jamaica, Sir Jeff Palmer's former primary school, though this did begin in late 2019 and has been severely challenged by lockdown and restrictions. Turning now to what we discovered, by far the largest slavery-derived cash legacy in the parish were those referred to previously, from the Reverend Gilbert Ramsay, who was born in the parish around 1658, and he served as rector at Christchurch, Barbados for nearly 40 years. Ramsay was an Episcopalian. He studied in Aberdeen, then still a stronghold of resistance, and he went out to an English colony pre-Union. Though descended from the Ramsays of Balmain, a landed family on the Angus-Aberdeenshire border, there are precious few records linking him to the family. His father, Alexander, was almost certainly a younger son of Sir Gilbert Ramsay, but appears to have come into no heritable property. Ramsay was educated at Marshall College, Aberdeen, graduating 1674. Before being ordained into the church, he undertook an MA at Balliol College, Oxford. He served first in Antigua from 1689 to 92, and then as rector at Christchurch, Barbados, 1692 to 74. Following the death of his second wife in Barbados in 1727, he left for Bath, where he died in May of 1728. In his will, he specifies legacies to a number of individuals and institutions, totalling £6,950, 10 shillings. His legacies to Burst Parish were income on £500 for a new school and teacher's salary, and income on the same to the Poor Fund. To Marshall College, he left income on £3,800 for a chair of Hebrew and Oriental languages and for student bursaries. Among his other bequests, to Balliol College, £10 for books. The rest of his estate he leaves to a cousin in Fettercairn in Aberdeenshire and to a nephew of this parish. The specified legacies in his will, not accounting for the residue of the estate, which we don't have a figure for, will be worth anything from 1 to 160 million in today's money, depending on how it's measured. As relative labour or income